Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Christopher Lubogo, and today, even as we celebrate independence, I would like to make some propositions in terms of the true dispensation of what we mean by independence. And then I'll take you through a ride of my book called The Executive Constitutional Mandate, Demystifying the Fountain of Honor, in terms of the presidential powers overreaching Uganda. But perhaps I would begin by saying that independence from the colonial rule is a concept that can be indeed approached, first of all, philosophically, but also perhaps jurisprudentially, to use that word, in a sense that we need to understand, first of all, what is inherent independence. Nations and cultures exist independently by nature, and human existence has actually occurred for a period of time, before even colonialism. So each with their own system of governance and culture and identity. Therefore, colonialism imposed what they call a foreign rule, disrupting this inherent independence. To use that in terms of euphemism as a tool, the idea is that the uncertainty in terms of the meaning of independence can be attributed to the fact that many African nations had to use euphemism to navigate the complexities of post-colonial power dynamics. So euphemism often masks the true extent of external influence and control, leaving a lingering ambiguity. So Uganda, obviously, like many other African nations, gained formal independence from the British in 1962. However, it faced challenges in establishing genuine self-determination due to what they call neo-colonial influences, or what they call economic dependencies and political pressure. So this makes it a prime example of how euphemisms were actually used to navigate through the complexities of post-colonialism. If you had to argue that in terms of philosophical undertaking, you would want to agree and say that from a philosophical point of view, true independence of a nation should actually entail not only political sovereignty, but also economic self-sufficiency in terms of cultural autonomy and the ability to shape its own destiny without external influences. So the use of euphemism might actually reflect the recognition that the full realization of this independence was a long and ongoing struggle. I would relate that to a wonderful book, what some people call the Tomia. Very big book, but very important, probably one of the biggest and best book in constitutional law in Uganda today. So the legacy of colonialism should be understood that independence should also be viewed in the context of addressing the legal or the legacy of colonialism, including issues of social justice, equity, and decolonization. So these are deep philosophical questions, obviously, and continue to shape Uganda and many other African nations. I will argue and also say that the concept of independence in African countries, exemplified, for example, by our country, Uganda, is more than a formal declaration. It encompasses a philosophical struggle in terms of to regain and assert all aspects of their inherent independence, and often requiring what they call a nuanced language and diplomacy to navigate the complex realities of a post-colonial world. So indeed the term independence can actually be seen as somewhat a misnomer when applied in terms of to the decolonization process. We will argue that shortly. In terms of inherent sovereignty, if you argue that in terms of inherent sovereignty, we can notice from the word go that nations and cultures have actually been possessed what they call inherent sovereignty and independence, and therefore these qualities are simply intrinsic to the human, and therefore to the existence of the fact that colonialism may have happened. So therefore it may not be very accurate to describe the process of decolonization as the granting of independence in terms of that perspective. And then in terms of regaining autonomy, we could be careful and argue and say that decolonization in itself was more about reclaiming and reasserting the autonomy and self-determination that has actually been suppressed or even manipulated during colonial rule. And therefore, the colonial powers didn't truly grant independence, but rather withdrew their so-called control, as it were. And I'll argue that as well. And I make that argument also in my book called Ubuntu Bulamu and the Law. I think some of you probably have come across that. In terms of substantive term alternatives, words that can be used to describe probably the same thing as independence. So perhaps instead of the word independence, terms like sovereignty, restoration, or even self-determination or decolonization might better be used in terms of extrapolating the essence of what actually occurred. So these terms usually emphasize the act of reclaiming inherent rights and the struggle for self-governance without implying that nations were previously dependent, as I just argued up there. In terms of long-term impact, using a more precise term can actually help acknowledge the legacies of colonialism, such as economic dependencies and cultural impacts, and also geopolitical complexes that persisted long after the formal independence was actually declared. I would like to make philosophical clarity in respect to what I'm saying so that we can comprehend and understand where I'm coming from. And then, as I said, I'll twin that to the book that we wrote, which is probably the locus classicus now in as far as constitutional law is concerned in our country. So in order to gain a more accurate terminology, we could lead to a greater philosophical undertaking, and thus help ourselves and the global community to understand the ongoing challenges and responsibilities that are probably associated with decolonization and nation building. So we need to revisit perhaps at a certain time and also redefine the term and use it to describe that the end of colonialism could actually offer a more accurate and philosophically sound perspective in terms of the process. And we acknowledge that the notions always possess what they call inherent independence and highlight the struggle to create what they call self-determination, making it clear that colonial powers merely withdrew control rather than granting true independence. I hope that DSFA can actually bring and paint the better picture that I'm trying to investigate here as we argue and discuss. I'll give a philosophical perspective, but also perhaps beginning with what they call an existentialist thought. If you were to argue in terms of an existentialist thought, when you're talking about philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre, who argued that true freedom and independence are actually inherent to human existence. In their opinion, they believe that colonialism was an existential crisis for colonial nations, and it denied them their authentic existence. So redefining the terminology could emphasize the restoration of authenticity and align with this philosophical view, not so. And if you're to argue that in terms of post-colonial theory, then you want to look at scholars like Frantz Fanon, particularly in his work called The Wretched of the Earth, where he argues that decolonization was actually a process of reclaiming culture and psychological independence. And he emphasized the importance of linguistic and cultural decolonization, using terms that highlight culture and psychological reclamation aligns with what they call post-colonial theory. So that is also important for us to argue in terms of making that discourse, as it were. When you look and listen to my friend Ngugi wa Thiong'o, in terms of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's language debate, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, obviously those of you who probably know him, was a Kenyan writer and a scholar. So Ngugi wa Thiong'o basically advocates for the use of what they call indigenous language in African literature and education. And he argues that the language is simply a vital aspect of decolonization because it allows nations to express their unique world views, not so. And this supports the idea that decolonization is about restoring culture and linguistic independence. Again, I say, please look for that book, Ubuntu, Bulamo, and the Law, by Isaac Christopher Lubogo. Find it readily. It will give you that discourse in terms of trying to understand those theories and undertaking that Ngugi wa Thiong'o was coming from. If you argue in terms of dependency theory, in terms of economics, for example, scholars like Roel Prebisch and also Semini Amin have actually criticized the economic impact of colonialism, and they argue that the former colonies often remained economically dependent on the former colonial powers even after formal independence. Think about that. So this economic reality, right, suggests that the term independence can actually be misleading, and it doesn't capture the ongoing economic complexity, not so. So you need to understand that as well. If we are to argue in terms of what they call the homogenizing effects of westernization, then I would like to argue that some scholars argue that colonialism had a homogenizing effect on cultures. In other words, erasing and subduing what they call local traditions and worldviews. In other words, redefining the terminology to focus on the recovery of cultural diversity and autonomy, which aligns with this particular perspective, not so. And so therefore, incorporating existentialism and also post-colonial and even economic theories, including or along with what they call real-world examples of the likes of Ngugi wa Thiong'o's language activism, can actually provide both philosophical and scholarly support in terms of re-evaluating the terminology used to describe the end of colonialism. So this shift in language can better capture the nuanced and multifaceted nature of decolonization, not so. We'll also continue to argue in terms of, again, philosophical perspective as well. If you're to look at incredible guys like Gandhi's Satyagraha, okay, Satyagraha, Mahatma Gandhi's philosophy of non-violent resistance, known as Satyagraha, sought to restore the inherent dignity and self-reliance of colonized people. It emphasized that self-discovery and the assertion of individuals and collective autonomy. Gandhi's approach basically aligned with the idea that colonialism suppressed these inherent qualities, okay? And then if you look at African Ubuntu philosophy, where the likes of Bishop Desmond Tutu, the likes of Nelson Mandela, the likes of Isaac Christopher Lubogo, who argue in terms of Ubuntu and the law. African philosophy on Ubuntu emphasizes the interconnectedness. Even Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., okay, the interconnectedness of humanity and the idea that I am because we are. And this philosophy highlights the communal and interdependence of nature of human existence. So therefore, decolonization from an Ubuntu perspective can be seen as a return to a more authentic and communal way of life. And that's the argument I make in my book, Ubuntu Bulamandolo, and perhaps at my PhD level in terms of the Doctors of Laws for purposes of that. So, but anyway, if you have to argue in terms of neocolonialism, then you will understand that the concept of neocolonialism, which was basically popularized by Kwame Nkrumah, asserts that former colonial powers continues to exert influence over nearly independent nations through economic and political means, not so. So this ongoing influence challenges the notion of full independence and supports the need to a more nuanced terminology. We would probably understand that then. So therefore, when we argue in terms of cultural hybridity, in terms of scholars like Homi, Braham, and who have actually explored the idea of cultural hybridity, where colonial cultures actually blend elements in their own traditions with those of the colonizers. This cultural blending underscores the complex nature of decolonization and the need for terminology that captures these nuances. So it's extremely important for you, again, to comprehend from that school of thought. When you argue in terms of post-colonial literature and narratives, it's important for us to appreciate and comprehend that works of what they call post-colonial literature and even narratives often depict what they call struggles of nations to assert their identity and autonomy after colonialism. Not so. So when you look at authors like Chinua Achebe, from your friend in terms of Things Fall Apart, and then the likes of Salman Rushdie in terms of the Midnight Children, provide insights into the complexities of post-colonial identity and nationhood. So therefore, incorporating these philosophical viewpoints, such as Gandhi's Satrahanja, or even African Ubuntu in terms of philosophy, and referencing scholarly concepts like neocolonialism, cultural hybridity, and even post-colonial literature, further will help us strengthen the argument of redefining the terminology in terms of describing the end of colonialism, not so. And therefore, these perspectives and examples highlight some of the ongoing quest for authentic and self-determination as cultural restoration in terms of what they call a post-colonial legacy as well. Okay, you may want to look at our book called the one that talks about the black man, right? So in terms of scholarly perspectives, along with examples, we may argue that it will give some terminology that I used to describe the end of colonialism, and I will argue in terms of what they call Amilcar Cabral theory of national liberation, right? Maybe some of you may know philosophical perspectives in terms of Amilcar Cabral's theory of national liberation. Now, Amilcar Cabral, who was a prominent figure in the liberation struggle of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, developed a theory of national liberation that actually emphasized the importance of cultural and even political awareness. And he argued that true independence could only be achieved by recognizing the culture and historical uniqueness of a nation, not so. And Cabral's idea aligned with the need of a terminology that encompasses cultural and political reclamation. So that is an argument that was propounded by that particular individual. Then another school of thought that probably would help us to comprehend what we're talking about is what they call Fanon's phenomenological of alienation. Okay, Fanon's phenomenological of alienation. Now, Frantz Fanon's philosophical work delves into what they call psychological and existential effects of colonialism. And he discusses how, for example, colonized individuals often experience a sense of alienation from their true selves and heritage. And revisiting the terminology would actually acknowledge the process of overcoming this alienation and also restoring what they call authentic identity. I think he has a point there in terms of regaining our, our roots of sorts. Not so. Perhaps we watch and look out for that movie called The Roots. Not so. And then if you have to argue in terms of African historiography, okay, or what we call African historiography, African historians like Sheikh, and Diop and Basil Davidson have actually argued for what they call a re-evaluation of African history from a pre-colonial perspective, and they emphasize the rich and complex civilizations that actually existed prior to European colonization. These historical perspectives underscore the idea that independence was, and in many ways, a return to pre-existing cultural and political autonomy, which I think I bears too, because I think that's true. I mean, who doesn't know that Africa, for whatever reason, was actually civilized with all intents and purposes? We had probably some of the Asian civilizations that probably ever taken place. If you had to argue in terms of globalization and cultural homogenization, then we would argue that some scholars that have globalization argue that globalization has actually led to the spread of Western values and cultures. Not so. Eroding what we call indigenous tradition worldwide, and the struggle for post-colonial nations to preserve and revitalize their unique cultures basically highlights the need for terminology that actually accounts for these ongoing challenges. And that is another aspect that we need to comprehend. But it's not, I know right now it's terminology, but a word is important, as Malcolm X sometimes said. I'll argue that later. Geographical realities often involve former colonial powers maintaining influence through international politics and economics, and therefore this ongoing influence in terms of complicities, in terms of the notion of to complete independence and support, would definitely engage for a support to call for a more nuanced terminology to encompass what we're talking about. So therefore, by drawing from these philosophical insights of figures like Amilcar Cabral and Frantz Fanon and different African historiography in terms of globalization, we can be able to have a continued geographical influence that can further emphasize the argument in terms of that particular term. So therefore, independence, in my opinion, falls short of capturing the complex and ongoing nature of decolonization. Redefining the terminology would actually help us offer and reflect what they call a multi-dimensional struggle in terms of aspirations for post-colonial nations. So additionally, in my opinion, philosophically, and as far as the scholarly perspective may take weight, along with these examples, we need to support arguments for redefining the terminology in terms of describing the end of colonialism, as it were. So, if you am to support that again in terms of a philosophical discourse, then I would like to argue that Amy Casey's discourse on colonialism. Now, Casey's influential essay, for example, argues and says that discourse on colonialism, from that where I'm coming from, he says, critiques the dehumanizing effects of colonialism. And he argues that colonialism's legacy persists even after formal independence, making it necessary to rethink the language used in terms of describing the process. Actually, his works underscores the need for terminology that recognizes the enduring impact of what? Colonialism. So that's what my question was, independence. Independence from what? Okay, and I'm not being offensive in any way, but I'm just trying to make an intellectual discourse. Then when you argue in terms of feminist post-colonial theory, feminist scholars like Chandra Mohanty and Gatrai Spikov have actually examined how gender intersects with colonialism. And they actually highlight that the struggle for independence often overlooks the unique challenges faced by women, for example, in post-colonial societies. And therefore, a redefined terminology should actually acknowledge the gender dimensions in terms of decolonialization. Also, maybe to also look at Professor Tamale's book on feminine in terms of decolonization as well. Indigenous rights in terms of movements, indigenous peoples worldwide have actually been fighting for recognition in terms of autonomy within post-colonial states, and their struggles actually have demonstrated that the term independence can actually be inadequate in terms of capturing their quest for self-determination, lands, and even their cultural preservation, as it were. If you had to argue that in terms of environmental concerns, then one would be quick to add that some scholars also have actually argued that the colonial legacy includes environmental exploitation in terms of degradation as well. And therefore, redefining the terminology could actually encompass the need for what they call sustainable development and the restoration of ecological balance as an integral aspect of post-colonial nation building as well. That's, in my opinion, quite important as well. And then if you argue that in terms of what they call transnational solidarity movements, then you would want to be quick to note that global movements, for example, in terms of organizations such as non-aligned movements, have actually emerged in this so-called post-colonial era to counterbalance the influence of the former colonial powers. And therefore, these movements illustrate that the quest for genuine autonomy often requires a collaboration beyond what they call national boundaries. And that is also very, very important. So when you argue that, then you probably want to agree that by incorporating Amy Casey's critique of colonialism in terms of feminist post-colonial perspectives, and there's examples from indigenous right movements and also environmental concerns and even transnational solidarity efforts, then we can actually further bolster the argument for re-evaluating the terminology used to describe the end of what? Colonialism. And therefore, these perspectives, in my opinion, would highlight the need for terminology that actually reflects the complexities. And therefore, this ongoing struggle and multidimensional nature of decolonization will continue to be a debate. And lastly, it's also important that true colonization is not merely an acquisition of political independence. It is a profound journey of rediscovering and rethinking or rekindling the intrinsic sovereignty, identity, and dignity that colonialism sought to obscure. And that is important, and that's my saying, and that's my proverb, in terms of the argument that I'm proponing, whether or not we should actually celebrate the argument of independence. Independence from what? When I make that discourse, I'm mindful of the fact that words can be used connotatively and denotatively. I'm also mindful of the fact that I think it was Malcolm X, formerly known as Malcolm K. Little, who argued and said there's everything in a word. I think it was Shakespeare who said, what is in a word? That we call a rose can still smell sweet, even if called any other name. But Malcolm X argued and said Shakespeare was living in the wrong time. He was living in a time when the word made everything. For example, black lives matter, or black matters as an advocacy in the US. Then you would understand that everything about the name has everything in terms of a description, in terms of what it would make you be, in terms of what people comprehend and understand about you. And I promise ourselves that we'll take you through a ride of my book, which draws a lot of emphasis in terms of what we are celebrating today as an aspect of independence, if you use that word loosely, in terms of this book called Executive Constitutional Mandate, Demystifying the Fountain of Honor, in terms of presidential power overreach in Uganda. I'm just trying to scribble through a few things here from the book itself on my laptop here. That's why I keep looking on the side, so that I can just emphasize a few points and we argue. So one of the things that I talk about is what they call solus populi, solus Dei, meaning that the welfare of the people is supreme. Solus populi, solus Dei. And in this particular book, I dedicate this book to all those innocent souls, the unsung heroes of this nation who have actually given their lives, blood, tears, and sweat for this nation. And I ask God to bless their souls in that capacity. And by way of opening remarks, I actually make an advocacy and say that when a country, for example, is hurting towards this destruction, merit and integrity are sacrificed at the altar of Altavinist ethnic jingoism, camouflaged through the process that are carefully choreographed to hoodwink the casual observers. And that statement was made by PLO Lumumba. Those of you interested, you can find that more in my book, or perhaps some of the books or writings that are written by PLO Lumumba in that aspect. Now, important to note as well is in terms of the synopsis. This book basically has been divided into a number of sections, and the first section basically consists of different chapters, which lays down a historical background as far as the origin of the office of the presidency is concerned, and then deals with several constitutional mandates that have been given, the rise of the aspect of presidential mandate. And then chapter 3 will deal with constitutional mandate in terms of the office of the presidency. And then chapter 4 will deal with the overreach in terms of the presidential. What can the president do and what can he not do? And then chapter 5 deals with proper constitutional mandate in terms of the aspect of the presidency. And then chapter 6 talks about constitutional options when the president does wrong. And then aspects in terms of the final thoughts. So you may want, and they're quite few chapters, but the book is quite big in terms of the content. I have never seen any book perhaps as big in terms of constitutional dispensation for purposes of law students who want to deal in constitutional law, or even those who want to have some information about constitutionalism in this country, way back from the birth of the country up to where we are right now, because it's probably the only book that bears that in mind. And so if I'm to take you briefly through some of the contents in terms of the chapter breakdowns, or in terms of the really table of contents, like we argue in terms of the constitutional mandate, trying to demystify the fountain of honor in terms of the presidential overreach. We argue in terms of the presidential historical times, up to the present times, by the way, and the different powers that translated in Uganda from way back in the Warren Council up to the present time. We argue in terms of the monarchical systems, for example, in 1962 up to 1963. We argue in terms of the First Republic, which we argue in terms of 1963 to 1971. We argue in terms of the Edward Mutesa era from 1924 to 1969, the military rule from 1971 to to 1979, the Second Republic from 1979 to 1986, the military rule from 1985 to 1986, the Third Republic from 1986 to the present, and then the involvement of the Westminster mode of government and its applicability in Uganda. We also argue in terms of the origin of constitutionalism, the Ordnance Council, as I tell you, 1902 Ordnance Council, the Lancaster and Marlborough conferences in 1961, then defining aspects of constitutionalism, structures in terms of the arrangement of the 1962 Constitution, then the 1966 Kabaka crisis and its implication in terms of constitutionalism today, the implication of the crisis in terms of constitutionalism, and then we also argue in terms of the mean era in terms of the militant politics and the destruction of formal constitutionalism, and then the National Liberation Front 1979 to 1980. Then we also argue in terms of the times of the NRA or NRM for that purpose, 1986 to 1995, then the so-called constitutional abuses that are substantive, and then the reinstitution of the term limits as a discussion also. We also argue in terms of the 1995 Constitution, marriage on a basically in terms of the marriage, the mirage of what we call a tabula rasa. What we mean, you will probably find out, and the rule of law in terms of relationship in terms of constitutional law, and then constitutional law and developing in terms of Africa, and then what is the constitution, the basic constants of constitutions, and then the constants in respect to common constitutions around the world, sources of constitutional law, the conventions, classification of these various conventions, then federalism versus unitary, when does federalism get its origin, aspects of republican versus monarchical constitution, the principles of constitutional interpretation. Then they argue in terms of the mandate of the presidency, then the forging of Uganda's imperial mandate, then the quoting of the Kabaka's executive mandate, the consolidation of imperial powers and executive mandate, and then the aspect of legitimization of the constitutional executive mandate, the birth of the Kabaka and the chief executive overreach, as it were. Then the aspect of the birth of the customary law as well, in terms of the embroidered English law, and then the birth of the Kabaka's authoritarian executive mandate, the complete surrender of colonial executive mandate, then the state versus religion, aspects of the Bakonzo crisis as well. We also talk about the aspect of the creation of the Karamoja and the Karamoja extradition law based on the undesirables, the so-called basis of the exile of the desirable by the executive. We also argue in the reshaping of Uganda by executive. Then we talk about the supremacy, the aspect of the executive supremacy overtakes in terms of parliamentary supremacy as the mantra of the judiciary. Then we also talk about the persistence of the executive mindedness, where we argue that sometimes the persistence in terms of executive mindedness dominates the judicial ideology, where we argue that sometimes the judiciary becomes more executive minded than the executive itself. And then we also argue in terms of the omnipotence of the executive power that has led to a continual addiction in terms of the notion of judicial restraint. We have quite detailed information here. We also talk about state in terms of religion, the army, the rape of the temple, the Karamoja question, and the faulty constitution promise, as it were. So when you look at this book, excuse me, when you look at this book, you probably will find quite a lot of information that is extremely important. I could go on and on and on in terms of this discourse, but I would like you to have, I don't want to deny the liberty of having a discourse. Let's do that in section 2. Yeah, so basically some of those aspects that we would argue. When you talk too much, sometimes you end up affecting your voice, but that's normal. We're here to serve the nation, not so. I talked about an argument in terms of the faulty constitutional promise, in terms of certain things that were promised of this country. Find out what it says in terms of also the prerogative of the president, find out what it says as well. And then the political question doctrine, when you argue in terms of Kelsen theory, but the legality of government and constitutional development. And then the start of the constitutional abrogation, and then the legitimization of Kelsen theory in terms of the argument for Uganda. I also make advocacy for the pigeonhole constitution, beginning from the pigeonhole crisis of yesterday, which other people who want to argue and say a validation of a bloodless coup. And then I talk about the ex parte Matovu case, then obviously the Dosso case, and then Kelsen versus the theory of law and state, and then the revolution doctrine in terms of being more executive minded than the executive itself. And then I also make advocacy in terms of unmasking what they call legal positivism as an executive political theory, and also make reference to Godfrey Binaisa's idiosyncratic justification of the Obote coup. and they call for the abandonment of the dominant executive political doctrine question as well. And then I also make arguments in terms of executive overreaches and the emergence of the president and political doctrine question in terms of these executive power overreaches. And then I also make reference to Justice Ogola's Rape of the Temple, particularly his poem, and the question of political representation in terms of Uganda's troubled history, and then the 2005 political referendum on political parties, and the format and pattern of electoral, elections as regards to representation, and then the abuse and the standards of presidential powers, then the aspect of general court martial, and what the NRM have actually done in terms of guaranteeing what they call the mandate versus the constitutional mandate, as it were. Then I talk about the aspect of militarization of the police in Uganda, and what do we mean by militarization of the police? The so-called unsubstantiated argument for political militarization, and then the political dangers of police, militarization. And then I also go ahead in terms of discussing what they call the posse comitatus as an advocacy for Uganda's jurisprudence and the life-threatening diseases in terms of the legality mandate, which happened during the COVID-19, you remember, and then the powers of the presidency, and then the so-called expert powers, and then the aspect of the commander-in-chief, and then the aspect of fountain honor, and then aspects to do with delegated powers of the president and hearing powers of the president, and then the emergence of the presidency, perhaps also the legitimacy of the limitations imposed by the presidential directive. Then I also make advocacy in terms of presidential mandates, the do's and the don'ts, and the sequence of presidential powers from the governors and constitutionalism, as it were, and then borrows a lot of jurisprudence from governors' powers and authority, and how this transcended over to the presidency. And then the reality in terms of the state of emergency amidst pandemics in Uganda, and then the origin of the state of emergencies, for example, schools of sorts under the concept of the state of emergencies, and then the legal framework for ensuring or guaranteeing a state of emergency, and its its component and its ratification or justification for that purpose, and then the rationale for the procedures. How do you declare a state of emergency in terms of, and then the reality in terms of that amidst a pandemic, for example, and the consequences the procedure can actually use when you're engaging in, for example, under the so-called Public Health Act, which is Cap 281. And then also the major consequences in relation to human rights in terms of the civilian rules or whatever obligations or even rights for that purpose. And then case studies that have actually declared certain state of emergencies, and then the authenticity in terms of the creation of the state of emergency, whether the president, for example, overabused or used his powers illegally in terms of engaging those, and whether or not what would have been the right procedures if at all he was wrong, and the definition of the true interpretation of the state of emergency as well. So quite a lot of substantive information that we probably would talk about. Then I also argue in terms of presidential immunity and correction. How about presidential correction in terms of immunities? The rationale for presidential immunity, the nature of the scope of presidential immunity, and then what do we mean by absolute immunity, aspect of the qualified immunity, and then international perspective, and then African Union perspective as well. And also the nature in terms of the scope of presidential powers and appointment, and the limitations of these presidential appointment, and then the consultation when it comes to requirements, membership, and the limitations in terms of the term limits. And quite exhaustive again. I also make the aspect of the doctrine of separation of powers in terms of obviously three arms of government. What are they supposed to do? Where do they end? And what is the relevancy today in terms of the applicability? Do we see them as rubber stamps, or do we see usurp or power by the executive in one way or the other? And I also borrow fastest from the doctrine of judicial independence as a safeguard in terms of what is captured in the 1995 Constitution, whether it is substantive enough. And then talk about the eligibility clause, and then sectarial courtesy, for example, and limitations in terms of the same. Then I talk about aspects to do with what they call solus populi lest esto, as I said, where the judiciary has actually found itself at loss by perhaps arguments have been overstood by the executive and all the other. And I make a lot of jurisprudential insights from the cases that were argued in Mbale. Some of you remember, and I call this the gospel according to Justice Kakuru, in terms of a judicial discourse for a case for constitutional change and sovereignty of the constitution, where I also make that that allusion that vox populi, vox Dei, meaning that the voice of the people becomes the voice of God. and the doctrine of basic structure, the aspect of Tojikwatako. And then also the participation of what they call public participation in terms of of raising this question, where I argue in terms of Solis Populi Suprema Lex Extol, meaning that the health and welfare of, in terms of good, or the salvation, or the felicity of the people, it becomes the supreme law. And I make reference in terms of that. But I also look at arguments of Justice, Lady Justice Elizabeth Mosoke, and also Justice Sekiru Gwinza, and also the judgment of Mwangusha, and the invasion of the parliament as preceded by the security agents on the 27th of September 2017, and also make arguments in terms of the judgments according to Justice Mugamba, Justice Esa Chisache, and then the Chagulanyi Elias Bobi Wine presidential election petition case. I also make in terms of what they call diminis non curat preta, lest preta. Now that the law does not concern himself with trifle things or little things for that purpose. And I also make inference on to Justice Sekoko, and also multiple voting and ballot stuffing, for example, and then demystifying the concept of diminis non curat less, and then make what they call the intersocial social and legal principles, where the act of giving another person the responsibility of carrying out the performance agreed in a contract, according to Justice Justice Dr. Professor Kanyahamba, also in terms of reference to that aspect. And I also make substantive discussion in terms of what they call ubi solitudam facit pacem appellate, which means that they make desolate and call it peace. You may want to understand where that comes from in terms of that discourse as well. And also what they call monumentalizing war and peace, and also in terms of an argument of tells from an ego's point of view, the second and third Kabaka crisis, and then the inexhaustible Buganda ghost question, which still haunts Buganda or Uganda today, which also reminds me of our book, Exhausting the Inexhaustible Buganda Ghost, which you need to find out at Lubogo Suigeneris.com. And then I also make aspects in terms of great reference to the so-called Magna Carta, not so, and then the 1900 agreement, and then 1953 to 55 Buganda agreement, and then the colonial office report in terms of the protectorate of Uganda presented to the secretary, then agreed recommendations, the so-called Namirembe, conferences, constitutional arrangements in terms of Uganda, and then statements. I have quite a number of statements and as appendices from the governors themselves, and the MOUs that were issued by Namirembe conferences on July 4th, 1776, and the declaration of the 13, for example, I also make comparison with the US in terms of the declaration of the 13th United States of America, and I put an appendix to that effect. So there's quite a lot of information, ladies and gentlemen, that you may want to find out from this book called Demystifying the Fountain of Honor, and discussing a constitutional executive power overreaches, sometimes that are enjoyed by most African presidents. So these are some substantive discussions that I make in our book. So I'll argue that you look at it, but also it raises quite fundamental questions and places the question home. You're going to find quite a lot of interesting discussions here that you may not find in many jurisprudence books in this country. For example, the arguments of the so-called shedding of blood, when the king of Uganda shed blood because he had actually, changed from one religion to the other, and the argument he came up to defend himself because he did not want to be circumcised, and the argument of the so-called Namugongo matters, where we actually realize that there are probably more Muslim matters in Namugongo than even Catholics and Protestants combined. And the issue of the Namasole saga that happened when the Namasole had to actually remarry. All those aspects make arguments to them, and even the suing of the Kabaka for taking another person's wife. Many of you may not know some of the documented effect in terms of the documentation that we have actually gathered from this heavily exhaustive book in terms of the constitutional law in this country. In my opinion, I think it's locus classicus. We have read all the books of the great giants of this country. Guess what? We've been able to comprehend and appreciate them for their efforts, but I think this, in my opinion, stands out as the Suigeneris book right now of the occasion, because, as I say, it addresses jurisprudence in terms of constitutionalism of Uganda way back up to where we are today, and how Uganda gets its flag, how Uganda gets its name, for example. All those questions are answered, and you'll be amazed at how much information you probably didn't know. So find our books at lubogo.org and suigeneris.com. And once again, congratulations to your country, to our country, to my country, on the 61st birthday. God bless Uganda. Thank you for God and my country.